You are listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. So, funny story, this whole episode was originally supposed to be about just two cards, the 5 and 7 of Swords. I've always found those two to be a little tricky to kind of figure out because on the surface they can feel really similar. And I know a lot of other folks have felt the same way. They both tend to carry this energy of conflict and manipulation, discomfort. And as I sat with these two cards, something else happened. And I went down this entire tarot rabbit hole and got completely sidetracked and ended up kind of just fumbling through the entire second half of the Suit of Swords. And it was actually really fun. So what kind of started out as this compare and contrast episode turned into something more like a psychological descent, or maybe even not a descent, maybe more of like kind of a spiral. If you think about how we can spiral as humans, that's really kind of what I discovered with the 5 through 10 of Swords. So what I discovered was through these 6 cards, 5 through 10, when we look at them in order, they actually tell a pretty remarkably accurate story about the ways we protect ourselves from pain, the way we deceive ourselves in order to feel safe. And then in the midst of all of that, the consequence kind of being this long-term suffering because we were not willing to look at kind of our core truth or the reality of the situation. And at the center of all of this is the 7 of Swords. And that card has always intrigued me in many ways, not just for its kind of like sneaky reputation that we tend to apply to the card, but also because I feel like we don't stop and look at the card closely, because if we did, we would realize that the person holding all these swords, they're holding the swords by the blades. Like, what? Who does that? And the more I sat with this card, especially in relation to all the other kind of second half of the swords, I realized, oh, maybe that's the whole point. Like, this isn't just about deception of others. It's about the ways we deceive and also hurt ourselves while trying to avoid discomfort. And yeah, so that image of kind of clutching the blades, holding on to something harmful in this desperate attempt to escape discomfort, the irony, really kind of ended up being this key to my rabbit hole that I went down regarding the whole second half of the sword suit. It really kind of transformed the way I view the swords, at least right now in this moment. Always subject to change depending on the day or how I'm looking at the card. So yeah, that's what this episode is about. A walk through the 5 through 10 of Swords, not just as individual archetypes, but kind of as this like emotional and psychological arc and story, like I mentioned earlier, kind of like maybe even a warning in some ways, like a cautionary tale, the cautionary tale of the sword suit, because it really acts as this kind of progression of what happens when fear is kind of the driving force behind our behavior, and when we are running away from like the reality of the situation or inner truth, or honestly, like when we ghost ourselves and, experience that kind of self-isolation and self-abandonment for really just short-term relief, which, is never really beneficial. But It's not all doom and gloom because what I discover and what you will learn at the end of this episode is that when we kind of end with the Ten of Swords, it's not just about kind of a literal ending or collapse. There's also a lot of potential and hope and possibility in that card. And I think some true space for catharsis in many ways. So if you can, grab your deck, pull out the swords 5 through 10, and follow along on this swords journey with me. There's this fleeting moment in the Five of Swords where everything kind of looks and feels victorious. But I think we would all agree that it falls flat and it feels kind of empty. I don't know a single person who engages with the Five of Swords and feels good. It has that energy of like ending an argument where maybe you're kind of technically right. And it's like, got you. But at the end of it, everyone is just left feeling totally mentally and emotionally gutted. And in the end, it doesn't even matter if you were right because nobody actually wins. And then no one really even remembers what the argument was about in the first place. So yeah, that's kind of what the Five of Swords feels like. And we've got this, person in the foreground collecting these swords like trophies. There's a sense of pride here. And, there are these two other folks walking away, which we tend to look at as, possibly, defeat, them kind of giving up. And, I think it's important to look at this, especially if we're looking at it through the lens of the example I just gave about the argument, where everybody loses in the end. Whether it's your dignity, a connection with somebody, trust in a relationship, because the relationship as a whole then becomes fractured and then you have to work on repairing it. And I think the Five of Swords could also be a depiction of kind of short-term or immediate satisfaction at the expense of yourself or a relationship, because it eventually will lead to long-term disconnection or long-term harm. From a psychological perspective, the Five of Swords really feels kind of like a protector part. So if we are viewing it through internal family systems work, IFS, parts work, the Five of Swords would probably be the part of us that jumps in to kind of control or kind of dominate the situation so that we don't feel exposed. So an exile can't get hurt. But that's not coming from a place of clarity or empathy or compassion. It's coming from a place of doing everything you can to avoid shame and pain. And in doing so, again, the irony is we end up creating more of it. It's this, you're left with kind of a relational carnage. And it really shows, the truth about how in that moment, when we're driven by fear and impulse, nobody's winning. So then if we move into the Six of Swords, which traditionally I've kind of always viewed as an archetype of autonomy, choosing the self, so to speak, we're moving away from pain and giving ourselves a second chance. However, when we contextualize this card between the 5 and 7 of Swords on this kind of sword spiral arc that I'm navigating right now, the 6 has to be read differently, not necessarily as healing, but as a fantasy of healing. It's really the daydream of escape. It's, the grass must be greener fantasy, which is driven home by the fact that we have a swords card completely surrounded by water, and water being that kind of emotional, dreamy element. But the swords are still in the boat with us, which I think is a really important component here. You're still bringing all of those stories and all those experiences and all those narratives with you. So the conflict, the grief, the unhelpful thinking patterns, the pain, just going to a new place, changing scenery doesn't magically change your life or your emotional state or the stories that you tell yourself. The six just becomes kind of, again, that fantasy of healing and not actually a representation of the work that's required to experience growth and self-evolution. And this really reminds me of that quote, wherever you go, there you are, which it kind of pains me to look at the Six of Swords this way, because the Six of Swords is truly one of my favorite cards in the deck. And like I said, I always view it as this kind of like autonomous card, and you know that you're bringing your past with you. You understand that the swords are still in the boat. But if we're looking at it through this particular arc, which is where my brain is going today, it is very much a fantasy. And actually, I keep thinking about the Dreamkeeper's Tarot, because that Six of Swords, oh my gosh, the artist just emphasizes this kind of fantasy idea so beautifully in that card in particular, because it really depicts this abstract fantasy-like movement or escape, kind of emphasizing, hope and what could be, but it's not grounded. Like literally, like this person's like in the air. I don't have the card in front of me, but like kind of flying along. I think it may be a swan. I'm not sure. I'll have to go back and check. But yeah, it's not grounded in any sort of practical or realistic action. And so this card really shows us that this is the moment that we move into a dissociative state and hang out with, this fantasy that we can find peace by running away rather than facing and integrating what's really going on within us or around us. Some people might say it's the ego's attempt to soothe, especially soothe those kind of like hidden parts of us that are in pain. It's like dreaming of a better life somewhere else instead of doing the work that you need in order to transform yourself where you are currently. So because there is some movement in this card, in the Six of Swords, it could act as a bridge between the external rupture that we see in the Five of Swords and then lead us into the internal denial of the Seven of Swords, which we're now about to talk about. Okay, so now we get to talk about the Seven of Swords. So the Seven of Swords is really kind of the inspiration behind this entire episode and is the whole reason that I'm going down this rabbit hole right now. And I've just been so struck by the fact that this figure, this person, is running off with these swords, holding them by the blades. I feel like it's such a telling detail that we do not spend enough time talking about, because it really implies a sense of recklessness, also some desperation, or if we want to go kind of like deeper and more internal, this kind of maybe unconscious willingness, because, this person clearly didn't think through what would happen if they grabbed these swords by the blades, but this like kind of, unconscious willingness to wound yourself, to harm, while escaping. And we could also look at it on the flip side and say, whatever you're leaving is so detrimental to your own well-being that you're willing to literally kind of like do something that could potentially harm you because that's better than the harm that is being inflicted upon you currently. So that's a whole different kind of pathway that we could go down here. But in the arc and kind of spiral that we're going down, we're going to kind of focus on how this is more of kind of self-inflicted, unnecessary pain and discomfort. Because, why would anyone run or walk or just let alone pick up swords by the blades, knowing how dangerous it is? And, if we know that the Seven of Swords is typically looked at as the card of deception, we could then say, okay, maybe this is a massive act of self-deception, because, this person in this card might believe that they're protecting themselves by, getting away with something, but they're doing so at like a pretty significant cost to their well-being. I mean, they're probably literally just like cutting themselves up with the very tools that they, believe might offer them freedom or safety. We could even look at this through more of a trauma-informed lens and trauma-informed behavioral analysis where any sort of like wound, especially early childhood wounds, teach us something. In this case, they might teach us that, we have to escape, lie, manipulate, anything to avoid pain or rejection. So yeah, but ironically, the avoidance inflicts its own kind of pain here in a multitude of ways. And I think another way to look at this card is, this person might not even necessarily be stealing the swords in a literal sense, because I think that the swords represent something deeper. So I wonder what it is. And again, this could be different for everybody depending on what you're going through. But what do the swords represent for you? What do you think that you are taking from someone else that you feel like belongs to you, but is actually hurting you in the process? So then after the Seven of Swords, we segue into the Eight of Swords, where, this person in the Seven of Swords clearly got themselves stuck in this space of self-constructed illusions and is now imprisoned potentially by their own escape fantasies if we're continuing, this sword story arc. Because in the Eight of Swords, this person's blindfolded, they're bound and then surrounded by the swords, probably the very ones that they previously stole or, ran away with. And, what's interesting too is this person's bound. And we were just talking about how these, swords likely potentially harmed them. I wonder if these are bandages on this person, not necessarily like rope or whatever, someone might be tied up with. So that's, I don't know, kind of food for thought. But when we're looking at the Eight of Swords, I think that it's really easy to say that the fantasy of the Six of Swords and then the escape of the Seven of Swords is now experiencing their consequences. So, those blades that were kind of being run away with as a trophy have now become a sort of imprisonment, a barrier, an obstacle that has entrapped them. And of course, this card isn't about actual imprisonment, but more of kind of the emotional, psychological, and mental imprisonment, especially internalized limiting beliefs, shame narratives, any sort of self-imposed constraints. And, the powerlessness that exists within this card is real. I don't want to negate that or downplay that, but it's also an illusion. There is a path out of these swords, but it's really hard for us to see, that we're still trapped in denial and fear, and we don't have the ability to fully see what's happening now, or we're choosing not to see our role in how we've gotten to this point in the Eight of Swords. And also, we're alone. We've completely isolated ourselves because we couldn't properly communicate when we were in that Five of Swords moment. And then, that self-isolation, that self-abandonment, even though we probably thought we weren't self-abandoning, leads us to the Nine of Swords. So the Nine of Swords, which we all know as the, kind of anxiety card, but, honestly, just viewing it as the anxiety card, I feel like actually really diminishes its depth, because it really is the kind of psychological consequence of that prolonged self-abandonment I was just talking about in isolation that is often created by the progression of, 5 to 8 of Swords. And, eventually all of our suppressed truths and betrayals, both of ourselves and others, and any sort of unprocessed pain will eventually come rushing to the surface, especially in those quiet moments when we're really forced to face them because we have no other way to distract ourselves. From a psychological lens, this Nine of Swords really is kind of the moment of authentic, unfiltered, painful self-confrontation. The fantasy has ended, the grass was not actually greener, and that self-deception has been unmasked. And the internal critic, that part of us that's kind of this amalgamation of old wounds and voices from caregivers and teachers and peers, and any sort of unresolved trauma is now just freely wreaking havoc on our mind and our nervous system, and is now just fully unrestrained inside of our mind. And then that leaves us with one of two options. We can either sit in this despair, collapse into the Nine of Swords, and stay there, or we begin the work of integration, which is where the Ten of Swords comes in. So the Ten of Swords is probably the most painful and brutal card and image, I think, in the entire deck. More painful to look at than the Three of Swords, more painful to look at than the Tower or the Five of Cups, because this person is laying here impaled by their swords. And there's a really strange stillness and irony here, because we don't know if those are the same swords that they ran away with or not. Are they new swords? Are they the swords that they were so excited to kind of take and run off with? We're not sure. Something that a lot of folks do like to point out, and understandably so, is that dawn is kind of breaking in the background. So even though there's darkness, the sun is about to rise, there is a new day. And I think a lot of folks like to point that out because so many of us are uncomfortable sitting in the discomfort of this image. So there's this kind of franticness to try and point out anything that might alleviate some of the discomfort. But the truth is there are still 10 swords in this person's back and something terrible has happened. The worst possible thing has already happened. And there's nothing left at this point other than to kind of stop resisting. In fact, there's nothing left to resist. And now we have no choice but to kind of surrender into the next phase. And we can look at this next phase, especially the 10, because we know 10s typically represent completion, is where maybe this false sense of self or this prior self has died. Some people might even refer to this as like an ego death, a symbolic death, an archetypal death. But the illusion and the self-deception is now gone. It's shattered. The fantasy has dissolved. There's kind of nothing left to be chasing or trying to find. And this kind of reminds me of, a quote that, if you follow Carl Jung's work, then, you've probably come across this quote at some point where he said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you'll call it fate. And the Ten of Swords is kind of that point where the unconscious has been made conscious. Unfortunately, through suffering, through the avoidance, through this kind of like cumulative denial experience of the swords. And yeah, at this point, what happens next? That's up to you. Thank you so much for listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. For more tarot and mental health content, follow The Tarot Diagnosis on Instagram. You can also subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and sign up to receive the Tarot Diagnosis emails, where you'll have access to exclusive spreads and exciting announcements. To join an incredible community of tarot and psychology enthusiasts, join the Tarot Diagnosis membership community, The Symposium, by visiting thetarotdiagnosis.com.